How can you ace your behavioral interview? First, what's the interview format? In most top tech companies, you're either asked technical questions that could be data structure or algorithm, or a design question if you're more senior, and also behavioral or leadership questions. Hey guys, I'm Arash. I'm a software engineer who used to work at AWS, Fidelity, NIH, and a bunch of startups. I've interviewed over 500 individuals. Behavioral interviews are supposed to be non-technical, but that's not really the case. There are two main types of behavioral interview that I've noticed in top tech companies. One is the one that Amazon established, which is leadership principle-based questions where they ask about the specific value. Each engineer is going to ask you one or two questions and they're looking for specific answers. For example, the value could be, are you action biased? So they would ask you a question like, tell me about a time when you were against a tight deadline, you needed to do further research, but you also had to deliver. How did you balance these opposing things and what happened? You want to answer these questions with the STAR method minus the T. Situation. You want to explain the problem, give the interviewer a lot of context, and ideally talk about the more complex problem because they make the judgment on how senior you are and how difficult of a challenge you can tackle. For example, my previous company offered an email service and we were facing multiple spam attacks. So we had to act quickly but couldn't disrupt the service. As you're talking about the problem, you should also mention some metrics. For example, what was the size of the spam attack? What were the things that were being impacted? Our initial analysis showed that 10,000 customers had received at least one spam email. Ideally, you should mention some business impacts too. 5% of the customers who received at least one spam email stopped using our service for 14 days. Or we got 60 calls to our business center where customers were concerned about their data. Mentioning these metrics is so good because it lays out the ground for the interviewer to be waiting to hear about the results, but also it tells the interviewer that you think at the business level. So it shows your seniority and the fact that you're not boxed in to look at things only from an engineer's point of view. Don't worry about T, I think they just added it to make the acronym sound cool, so go with SAR. Later on, they also came up with this acronym called CAR, which stands for Context Action Result. Action is where you spend most of the time, so you talk about the research you did, about the different teams that you talked to, about the code that you wrote, about the challenges that you ran into as you were doing these things. So you show the interviewer your depth of knowledge, the fact that you became an SME throughout this process, and that you got things done. Results. This is basically where you say you saved the world and without your work, humanity would not exist. So the metrics that we refer to in the situation have to come up here too. Ideally, you want to talk about a few metrics that you were targeting plus a couple of bonus points. For example, you can say as we were addressing this situation, we also learned that the performance there was terrible. So along the way, it was easier for us to address that too, which improved things by 15%. Remember, most interviewers are engineers like you, so don't try to bullshit numbers. For example, if you say you improved some performance by 15%, and I ask you, well, how did you measure that? You should be able to answer that question. Personally, I would also add an L section for lessons. At the end, you want to say, these are the things that we learned from this experience. And if I had to go back, these are a few things that I would do differently. For example, you could say, now that I've collaborated with multiple teams, I realized that front-loading the AppSec review would save the team a lot of time because that was something that delayed us by N weeks. Similar to other portions, the lesson that you mentioned ideally should be a little bit more complex than something that is very basic. Because although they're asking you about that specific value, they read between the lines about how senior you are. The second way that I've seen companies like Google or Facebook conduct these interviews is one single behavioral interview. Usually these conversations are pretty casual, but considering the fact that you're talking to Googlers or people who work at Facebook, normally, unintentionally, they make it a design interview. So they may ask you something that's supposed to be about culture or fit, and then somehow the conversation goes into design because you're a software engineer, they are engineers, and somehow for engineers, it is very hard to just talk non-technical. For these companies, you need to do some basic research about their culture and what they claim to value. For example, Meta has a mission of connecting people and they claim to value diversity. So they may have a chat with you about what are the things that you did that you thought embraced diversity at your previous company? What are some ideas that you have to contribute to diversity if you join Meta? Interviewers that are smarter try to work through something with you, so not necessarily something that's too technical, but something that requires a conversation. And they try to see how well you receive feedback, how you build on a conversation. If you're just fake agreeing with everything, if you're adding value to the conversation, if you can state your disagreements politely and not make other people defensive. So these companies try to create a lot of process to take out bias out of the interview. I think it helps, but they haven't been super successful with that method because they almost equate humans with bias. So they try to take the human out of the interview, which makes the interactions very robotic. On the flip side, in smaller no-name companies, people's gut feel is a much bigger factor. So basically, if you interview with a hiring manager or a director and they don't like your clothes, then you're not hired. The opposite of it can happen too. You may walk in somewhere and they really like the way you speak, even though you have no idea what you're doing. They may hire you just because they're biased in your favor. So behavioral interviews can be subjective, and like everything else in life, there are parts of it that are out of our control, but there is so much that you can work on to ace your interview. Do your research about the company, read about their values, think about a few of your past experiences, the projects you have worked on, and think if you can answer common questions about them. Be genuine, talk about the stuff you actually have worked on and the way you'd like to work with your future colleagues. Give credit where credit is due, but usually you should use the word I as opposed to we. You're talking about your values, your work, and the results that you achieve. The company is assessing you, not your previous team. So take ownership and use the word I. If you're getting prepared for interviews, I wish you the best of luck. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the future videos. See you soon.